Thank you, Scott and Jeff.
Let's see if I can-
I'm a little emotional, but I'll go ahead and introduce our next speaker, Bill Atkin. He is also an attorney, has practiced international law and has traveled the world, and for the last 20 years or more has been an attorney for the church. Some of his family live in my ward, and I did call and get one more personal bit. I found out that he has a hobby of farming, and so he moonlights as a farmer. So I'll go ahead and introduce Bill as our next presenter. Thank you.
You'll find one of the ports. Is that the power cord? That's the power cord. It's fine. Raise your
Not that one.
That one.
Right here. Just making sure, no, we'll have to search.
It's not doing it yet.
So it's searching right now.
Okay. We'll be patient.
For the source. They have to cycle through a couple of those.
Stretch.
It's just, if it's a cycle, then it's searching. It'll find it, it'll find it. Pretty sure it just takes a few minutes.
Okay, I'll be patient. That's a virtue.
Yeah, and if you want to go ahead and start, but if you can't, you don't.
Well, I prefer to,
I suggest for this, you just wait.
okay, I'll just wait for a second.
It takes the projector a few minutes to find the computer.
There you go.
There we go. Okay, there we go. We can probably get it there. Okay. Right there, that's great. Our brethren, sisters, and cousins mostly. It's wonderful to be here. And I feel honored to be able to talk about our ancestors in this forum. This is fabulous. David, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of hours that this group put into putting this together, but I've enjoyed everything that I've participated in so far, so thank you very much. I'm going to take a personal privilege here for those of you that come through Edward, Lil, Lyman, and Mary Miranda Collister. there's going to be a John and Clarissa Lyman Smith reunion, which will be held on October 5th. And I'm really looking for mailing lists, so if any of your families have mailing lists, if you can give me an email list, I'll be happy to make sure that everybody in your family gets the announcements. Currently, I feel a little bit like I was in a meeting with the dean of BYU Law School, and he was laughing. He said, you know, when they have faculty meetings, you can imagine what a terrible thing it would be to have a faculty meeting with a bunch of law professors. And he said, in one of the meetings, he said, I think everything that needs to be said has been said. But of course, not everyone has had a chance to say it. And I feel a little bit like that this morning over the last 2 days. Everything that I could have possibly said about Edward Partridge, his daughters, Amasa, Lyman, with respect to the Partridges, has been said. And I've enjoyed very much. So there might be a little repeat. I'm going to try to do it very high level so I don't bore you. But I was talking to one of my colleagues at work, and he said, I said, I'm going to be going to Fillmore this weekend to talk about the Partridge family and their contribution to the church. And he just looked so quizzical. He said, what on earth did the Partridge family contribute to the church? And I said, I don't think you quite get which family I'm talking about. But those of you that do remember the Partridge family, and maybe even had some kind of a teenage crush on any of them, let me disabuse you of that crush. Here's what they look like now. Of course, we don't look any better, actually. I have to remind myself I'm at the age where I don't look the same way I did when I was in the 70s traveling on a bus singing. My topic today is the legacy of the Partridge family. It's a legacy of church history. It's a legacy of family. And we're here as family to talk about their legacy. Now, I'm not a trained historian like Scott. I'm just somebody that loves family. I've always loved family history. I've always loved church history. And so I've read a lot, but again, I'm not a historian, and I don't pretend to be. So I just want to share with you some of the feelings of my heart with respect to, and I think those are the same feelings that you all respectively may have with respect to your relationships in the Amasa Mesa Lyman family. Recently I attended a conference at BYU. The conference was on religious freedom, but Elder L. Whitney Clayton gave the keynote address. And let me share with you something he said, which rings pretty true to my heart, and I think that's the reason we're here. He said, a few years ago, Elder Jeffrey R. Holland spoke about impoverished handcart pioneers who walked the dusty or freezing 1,300-mile trail to the Salt Lake Valley, often bearing spouses or children along the way. Why did they do it? How did they do it? Elder Holland said, they didn't do it for a program. They did it because the faith of the gospel of Jesus Christ in their soul. It was in the marrow of their bones. Then he went on to say, I cannot separate who I am, and this is where it really touched my heart. I cannot separate who I am from the faith that inspired those pioneer ancestors who chose to sacrifice everything for the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, if you could take one sentence of the whole weekend, I would say that sentence. I can't separate who I am from those ancestors of mine and from the faith that inspired them, truly, to choose to sacrifice everything for the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, with that introduction, let me talk briefly. I couldn't figure out, well, how am I going to approach this? Because so much has already been said, and you're going to hear some of the same stories. So I'm going to try to keep it a high level. I'll tell you a story. Russ Taylor isn't here, but a number of years ago, I was in New York City. I had a day. I was there on a Friday and a Saturday, and I had an event on Saturday night. So I thought, well, Friday, let me rent a car, and I'll drive to Pittsfield, Massachusetts. Now, why Pittsfield, Massachusetts? Because that was the home of the Partridge family. And that's where Edward was born and raised. So the city of Pittsfield is in western Massachusetts. I drove from New York up to western Massachusetts. I got there around 6 or 7 o'clock. It was in June, so it was one of those long summer days. And I thought, well, let me head over to the cemetery. So I ran over to the cemetery. Isn't that where you go when you're looking for ancestors? You go to cemetery. So I went to the cemetery. The office was closed. The sexton's office was closed. So I had no idea, but this was the cemetery, a huge cemetery if you've ever been there. It's rolling, beautiful hills. And it's been there for hundreds of years, and there's lots of headstones. And I just said a little prayer. I said, so I started driving around, and the first place I stopped, I just stopped, I looked over to the right, and there was a headstone for, who do you think it was for? William Partridge. It was Edward's father. I thought, well, that's a tender mercy. So I sat and reflected for a while with the tombstone. The next morning I got up and said, well, let me find out if there's any history here in Pittsfield about the Partridge family, so I can identify maybe where the Partridges lived and did those things. I went cold, I didn't have any information with me. Went in the library, they said they had a special collection, so I went in the special collection, and they said that they had just recently prepared an index for all of the names that are referenced in all of the books, historical books for that particular area of Massachusetts. She said, what are you looking for? And I said, I'm looking for William Partridge. So she looked in the index, she referred me to a book, and you know whose book it was? It wasn't really a book, it was Russ Taylor's paper. I think all of you must know the story. He worked in special collections at BYU, and one time they had purchased a bunch of early New England almanacs. And the almanacs are just calendars, essentially. And he was browsing through it, and he found one for Partridge, and he started browsing through that, and it was William Partridge's almanac. There's an amazing history that you can find just with notations on a calendar. It's quite interesting. My grandmother did that. She ran the little cash store, which is a misnomer, in Oak City, Utah. And she just had on her daily ledger, she'd write half a paragraph, not a paragraph, half a sentence, or she'd say, and if you annotate that, it becomes a really great source for family history. Well, that's what I found in the Pittsfield. So when I got home, I called Russ Taylor at BYU, and we started dialoguing, and he shared with me. And every year he's continued to update his annotations on that. So I highly recommend it if you haven't seen it. I think it's online now. Is it online? Russ Taylor's annotations of the William Partridge almanac. But whether it is or not, there's a really deep source. And somebody yesterday referenced the fact, you know, historians, again, I'm not a historian, but there's a lot of facts that are a little fuzzy. Every presenter has his own version of the facts on history. Somebody said that after Joseph baptized Edward, he just disappeared. And then he shows up at his home. Well, my understanding was that Joseph said, Edward, you must go and try to take the gospel to your family. So that's why he went, instead of going back to Kirtland, Painesville, he headed off to Pittsfield so he could see his family. But that aside, there was a little entry. Edward came home today. That's all it said in the almanac, William Partridge's almanac. Edward came home today, and then a couple of weeks later, Edward left. But then Russ Taylor can fill in all of that history, that what happened for that period of time when Edward went back to Pittsfield, Massachusetts. So I decided to organize this presentation just briefly over some of the principles, what I learned from my ancestors, and particularly from the Partridge family. So I just picked themes, and I'm just going to tell anecdotes that are relevant to that same theme. These anecdotes, most of you know better than I do, but I'll just run them through quickly. First one is sacrifice. You cannot read the Partridge history without knowing how deeply, deeply, deeply they sacrificed for their testimonies and acceptance of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the restored gospel. People have read, and I have it, I don't think I'll read it because I've heard it 3 times in the last 2 days, but Emily Partridge writes about her home, and the Partridge home in Painesville, and she remembers this. My father was doing a thriving business as a hatter. He had accumulated considerable property and had provided a very pleasant and comfortable home for his family. I think my father must have been almost a rich man. Now, I don't know her perspective. Painesville and wealth is probably a little bit different than how we would view it. I remember a very pleasant home such as I have not had since. Now, if you know the Partridge family, that's the last place they really lived in kind of decent housing. Even after they came to Utah, even after they came to Fillmore, their housing was never kind of comparable to what they had in Painesville. So they did have a very comfortable lifestyle on the western frontier at that time. Now, you can look, every one of the homes they lived in for years, in fact, the rest of the decade for Edward Partridge, he didn't really have anything that you would say was a home. And as a result, the family didn't really have anything that you would say is a home. And we're blessed because Eliza and Emily both did journals and autobiographies. And so we learn a lot of the Partridge family through their diaries. But she tells when they left Clay County, and we'll talk about that in a minute too, but in 1833, after the persecution, and the Saints were told to leave Independence, and they fled across the Missouri River in November, I believe. It was snowy, and they ended up on the other side of the river. This is what they lived in. That's obviously just a picture. It wasn't the actual cabin. They couldn't find anything to live in. So Edward Partridge and Brother Correll, who had been part of the leadership of the church, found an old abandoned cabin that had served as a stable. So how many of you'd like to live for a couple of years in an old abandoned stable? They got into it, which is interesting. It had one large room with a fireplace, and Glenn Russell last night talked a little bit about that, how the ink was freezing, it was so dang cold, and Edward was kind of huddled around the fireplace trying to write, and the ink kept freezing. It had a lean-to also, so it wasn't just one room, it was one room with a lean-to. But they quickly found that the lean-to had no possibility of inhabitation. The floor was rotten, and underneath the rotten floor were rattlesnakes and rats, and so they quickly decided they weren't going to use that part of the cabin. So, but they lived there for, interestingly enough, Eliza called it a miserable old house. I think she was being generous to even use the word house. But they lived there for 2 years. 2 years, 2 families of 15, 16, 17 people. Now you can imagine that contrasted with what their life had been in Painesville. Now I'm using this only as an example because you've heard over the last 2 days, every time they moved, they ended up in something like this or worse. You remember right before when they crossed the Missouri, the first time they'd ever slept outside. We go in camp houses, sleep outside. They had to do it by necessity. Consecration. Now, I personally can't go to the temple and not sit and think of Edward Partridge when we talk about consecration. And as the bishop and as the first bishop, and his responsibility was pretty much the law of consecration. He was the trustee for all of the property when they went to Missouri, and then it was his job to assign property to different families, support it. But he wasn't. Have you ever heard the term OPM, other people's money? That wasn't Bishop Partridge. He started from the get-go. He put his money, he consecrated his money to the church. He liquidated all of his business and holdings in Ohio. He had to use agents to do that because he was down in Missouri. So he used agents. They liquidated everything. There's an interesting quote from his brother, but he didn't, everything it was a fire sale, so, buyers and sellers. If you know it's a buyer's market, it was definitely a buyer's market, so he didn't really realize, I think, the value of his property. But he did come out of it. His brother wrote him many years later and said, I understand that you sold that beautiful farm for a 15-year-old horse, which I don't think is accurate, but that was his brother's perception from Massachusetts. Now, he developed or had enough resources. It was about $10,000 in gold. What did he do with that money? He didn't build a nice home in Independence and put his family in that nice home. He simply took that and turned it over to the church which was him, and he used that to buy properties for the saints. Today's value of that, I calculated, Google's wonderful, I just ran an index, and they said it'd be equivalent to today's dollars of $250,000. But not a penny that was spent on his family. All of that was spent on the church, and particularly the Colesville saints who came without anything, in poverty. So, consecration from the very beginning of his relationship with the church, nervous in the church, he consecrated it all. Long suffering, is that an attribute that we're supposed to have? We all want to have it long in a very short term. Their long suffering, at least for Edward, was 10 years. The family suffering continued well beyond that 10 years. The long suffering, children in independence, the LDS children, the Mormon children, some of them were having nightmares because there'd been so much talk about mobs, and they would wake up in the middle of the night and say the mobs are coming. They'd scream that out in their nightmarish dreams. The mobs are coming. Well, as you know the story, the mobs did come, and they came on July 20th. I don't know how many had been independence, but the Partridge home was maybe half a mile from the public square, and the printing press, the W.W. Phelps printing press, was maybe a half a block from the courthouse. A little bit slightly different directions. But the mob came, they had a whole list of causes against the saints. And saints really had a couple of years is all they'd been there, so there was a lot of animosity that developed in a short period of order. I kind of loved it. I love Jeff Foxworthy and his redneck jokes. Lydia came pretty close to talking about the rednecks in Missouri compared to the more refined people from New England. They eat cornbread. They don't have white flour. She went through a little description. But regardless of the makeup, that's what happened on July 20th, is they gathered at the courthouse. They were pretty upset with the saints. They marched down to the printing office. Last night, Glenn Rosen mentioned the fact that that's where the famous story, the two little sisters that grabbed their papers and ran into the cornfield and hid with printing sheets of the Book of Commandments, and that's what we have of the original Book of Commandments, is what they had. After they were through with that, they decided they should send somebody down and get Bishop Partridge, who was responsible for the leadership of the church in Missouri. So they marched down to his home. We have 4 accounts, really, and they're moving accounts. 2 from Edward Partridge's own hand, so it's a autobiographical account of what happened when the mob came, took him from his home. We have an account from Lydia, who dealt with both the beginning and the end. She wasn't in the middle. She wasn't at the town square when they tarred and feathered Bishop Partridge and Brother Allen. But she was home when they grabbed him. She was home when he had to come back. This is where I first learned anything about church history. It's from my mother telling me the stories about partridges sitting up all night, boiling water, pouring the boiling water. Now, when we say tarred and feathered, it's not the kind of tar that we have today. It's much more like the pitch from a tree, a pine tree. But they had mixed lime ashes in it because the feeling was that would make it more painful for the person who's being tarred and feathered. We heard last night, too, it wasn't his pants. They were going to strip him naked. They did take his pants, but he pled with them to leave him with his undershirt and his pantaloons. And so they did. They took pity on him like that because he didn't want to be in society naked. Anyway, they tarred and feathered and went back. You heard the story of how the kids hid because they thought an Indian was coming down to their home. But that's where I learned the beginning of church history, is how when they poured hot boiling water on the pitch, on the tar, and as they peeled that off, some chunks of flesh came with it. And that was truly, most historians believe this is the beginning of the end for Bishop Partridge. He was at the ripe old age of what, he was in his early 40s at that time. He was one of the old men of the church to begin with, but the travails of Missouri caused him to ultimately expire at a very young age when they got to Nauvoo. This is one of the things that Edward reported. He said, I told them, talking about the mob, because they wanted him to renounce his religion and leave Missouri immediately. If he'd agree to that, they'd leave him alone. He said, I told them that the saints had suffered persecution in all ages of the world, that I had done nothing that ought to offend anyone, that if they abused me, they abused an innocent person, that I was willing to suffer for the sake of Christ, but leave the country I was not willing to consent to. Another principle, martyrdom. I just gave a quick introduction of that. He died not long after they came to Nauvoo, and he was one of the early martyrs of the church. There were other martyrs in the Missouri period, but everybody agrees, and Joseph Smith called him one of the early martyrs of the church. He died at the age 46. How many here are 46 or younger? There aren't very many of us. His obituary read the following: a life of greater devotedness to the cause of truth, we presume, was never spent on this earth. Talking about Bishop Partridge. His religion was his all. For this he spent his life, and for this he laid it down. He lost his life in consequence of the Missouri persecutions, and he is one of that number whose blood will be required at their hands. Praise to the man. You know the verses to that. There's a similar sentiment in praise to the man for Joseph's martyrdom. And as a church, we deplore our losses, but we rejoice in his gain. He rests where persecutors can assail him no more. They cannot bother Brother Joseph again. Obedience. If there's one thing besides sacrifice, consecration, that I would add to the Partridge family and the Lyman family's list of gospel principles that we learn from them, one would be obedience. Obedience to what? Independence Temple lot. This story touched me very deeply when I first heard it. Prophet dedicated the temple site in 1831, and then a few months later, Edward Partridge bought the temple, what's called the Independence Temple lot. The Hederikites and the RLDS Church, now the Community of Christ, own portions of that. We have a humble, may I say, nobody hears from church history. Oh, yeah, we do back then. Ugly visitor center at Independence. Bought the property. In 1848, as the Saints were trying to get to the great Southwest, get to the great Salt Lake Valley, they needed money to travel. And Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, and others of the church leaders got together, and they had been approached with an offer for them to be paid to sell whatever interest they had. It wasn't clear what interest they did have, and we won't go into all the legal stuff. But that all the name of the property in Missouri was in the name of Bishop Partridge. He was the trustee for all that property as the bishop. So his name was on the lease, or not on the lease, on the transfer, on the deed for the temple lot. Not a brother actually, I don't even know where he was coming. James Poole was the person that approached the brother and asked if they would arrange for a quitclaim deed, and he would pay $300 for the quitclaim deed. It ended up that Lydia and Emily, Caroline, and Eliza went to Missouri and signed a quitclaim deed for consideration of $300. But Lydia said that after all the blood and sacrifice and suffering and tribulations the saints had in Missouri, that was a very, very hard thing that she and her family were being asked to do, to deed away the temple. And you can imagine their feelings, since that had been so much a part of why they were in the church in Missouri. One of the Partridge biographers wrote the following: Lydia and the girls signed the quitclaim deed with what bitter feelings of reluctance only they knew. But young Edward Jr., would have none of it, and he refused to put his name to the paper, which took the church temple site out of the Mormon church, perhaps forever. Now, I don't believe it's out forever, but you can imagine the feelings they had to make after all their sacrifices to go ahead but they were obedient. Brigham Young asked them to do it, and they did it. Polygamy. That's a big part of the Partridge family and the Lyman family, obviously. And that's how the Partridge family became part of the Lyman family, was because of polygamy. Emily and Eliza were, you know the story, they were working in the mansion with Joseph, with Emma, as to help her with her domestic chores. During that time period, Joseph approached both of them independently, and he was sealed to both of them, and then they each found out that both of them had been sealed. Emma had been really friendly to them, and not to throw Emma under the bus, but after she found out, in the morning she found out, by evening she wanted them gone and never to see them again. And so they did have to leave the Smith home. At the invitation of the 12, after the martyrdom of Joseph, I think you all know this story too, the 12 said, what are we going to do with all of the celestial wives that Joseph has? And they all agreed as a quorum that they would offer to be married to any of them if they wanted a husband for the remainder of their mortal life, all realizing that they were sealed to the prophet. And so they approached those, and of course, Emily and Eliza were approached. Emily chose to be sealed, or to go with Brigham Young, Emily Dow. Eliza went with Amasa, and Carolyn had already been plural wife of Amasa, and then later Lydia, which was the youngest sister. So that's how all four of the Partridge daughters became polygamous wives, 1 to Brigham and 3 to Amasa. Edward Partridge Jr. was also a polygamist, and so the entire family participated in polygamy. Lydia Clisby said this, which I always thought was fascinating. Polygamy is true and is an institution of heaven. This is the mother, and the mother never was a polygamist. I received it from the mouth of the prophet who taught and practiced it to the day of his death. My children are all in it, and they prefer it to monogamy, and their children are as much respected as they otherwise could be, notwithstanding all that our enemies say to the contrary. Now, I'm sure that there were some tough times, and we'll talk, if you want to talk sacrifice, talk about those polygamous relationships with Amasa, who was never there, and they pretty much had to fend for themselves. Now, colonizers, this is another sacrifice. And this is where I'm going to ask any of you historians who have contrary facts to let me know. Yesterday we had a talk from, what's his name? Lamont, yeah. Lamont talked, and I approached him later, and I said, I knew part of what he said, but I've heard other things, and so he's going to see if he can get the reference for me. But I had read that Wilford Woodruff, when they were talking about the San Juan Mission, those were the saints in southern Utah. It was Parowan, Cedar City, Paragona. That area were those that were going to be called to colonize the San Juan River. But I understood that Wilford Woodruff had recommended that they include the Partridge brothers. Now that's quite interesting, because at that time none of these brothers were named Partridge. They were named Lyman, but their mothers were Partridges. And so I think it was quite interesting that they were being cognizant. And I take that to mean that they understood the contributions that Edward had made and the sacrifices his family were making, and he wanted to make sure that they could be included. So on August 29th, we learned about this yesterday, they received a letter from John Taylor. It was Platt D. was the recipient of the letter, advising him that the Quorum of the 12 had called Platt to be an assistant to Silas Smith. As we heard yesterday, he ended up that Platt really ran the expedition. Silas was a state legislator, was doing all the logistics to support the mission, but it was Platt D. that did. And then the letter also said, you are also at liberty, this is what I think is so interesting, to take with you some 5 or 6 of the Partridge families. Now, who were the Partridge families? Well, it was the children of Edward's wives, or of Amasa's wives that had moved to Oak City, essentially. So those were the Partridge families. These were the names on the original expedition. It was Platt D. Lyman. I know there's some Platt D. Lyman relatives here. Edward Bill Lyman, who was my great-great-grandfather, Ida Lyman, Joseph and Ellie Roper Lyman, May Lyman, and Walter C. Lyman. And there may be some Walter Clisby relatives. Are there? That's your line, okay. So those are the Partridge / Lyman. But I'm just fascinated that the Quorum of the 12 would call them the Partridge families and not the Lyman families. Okay, women of faith. If there's one takeaway that I have when I read about the Partridges, it's the faith and the strength of the women in that family. I love this. Many of you know this. Wallace Stanger, who wrote about the pioneers, he said, Mormon men were strong, talking about the pioneers, but the Mormon women were incredible. So the sisters and sister cousins here, you are incredible, and you have that in your DNA. We could do a whole conference just on what you learn from the tenacity, the loyalty, the stick-to-itness, as they say down in the Bluff, from the Partridge women. Just incredible. They always found a way to economically take care of themselves, took care of each other. Lydia said this, as respects the women of this community, you know, in the 1880s and 1890s, the world was beating up on Mormons about polygamy. Lydia said this, as respect the women of this community, we are not the downtrodden race our enemies represent us, but we are as free as the air we breathe, inasmuch as we are disposed to do right. She was talking about LDS women, Mormon women. This picture actually is quite interesting because Utah was the first place to have women vote, to approve women voting. And this was Susan Anthony came to Utah to support the movement of the Utah women in asking for the right to vote. And so Utah has a distinction. That was because of the strong women then and now in the church. Family. It's hard. The Partridge sisters and mother and brother really were a family in every sense of the word. You read their stories, they were unified. I never saw any hint that there was any dissension between any of the members of the family. And this goes well after Edward had passed away. Loving, caring, supportive of each other. Yesterday, and everything I read, Scott Partridge's manuscript, everything I read was the Partridge sisters and their mother took care of each other in illness, in raising children, in supporting each other economically, financially, and having joint ventures to get some kind of acceptable housing. They just spent their time blessing each other's lives. Posterity, 7 children from Edward and Lydia, 38 grandchildren, 233 great-grandchildren. Now, the great-grandchildren, that was my mother's generation. And I total posterity, I have no idea how you calculate that. Back in 1980, one author said, well, maybe there's 10,000. I don't believe that there's 10,000. I think there's got to be 20 or 30,000 descendants of Edward Partridge that are in the church today. Faithful in all things. This was an article that was published in Ensign magazine on Edward Partridge by Dean Justice. And I think many of you, if you haven't read it, just go Google it. It's a really good summary of Edward Partridge and his life, and a little bit on his family. I was going to jokingly say that if you wanted me to talk about the legacy of the Partridge family in the church, I would give you 3 words: James Esdras Faust, who's one of our cousins. And there are many, many others. This is what Dean said. From the day Edward Partridge accepted the gospel in 1830 until the death of his last child, 78 years later. So that was 78 years between the time Edward joined the church and the last of the Partridge passed away in the early 1900s. He said, his family seems to have passed through continuous travail. Great phrase, continuous travail. And that's the takeaway from reading their history. What gave them stability to withstand the recurring storms of adversity that descended upon them, especially when so many close associates experienced many of the same trials but did not survive in the church? And this was one of his observations. He said, perhaps part of the answer is found in Edward's statement. I have torn my affections from this world's goods, from the vanities and the toys of time and sense, and been willing to love and serve God with all my heart and be led by his Holy Spirit. As a result, quote, my mind has been, as it were, continually expanding, receiving the things of God until glories indescribable present themselves before me. And then Dean concludes, perhaps this was the anchor to his soul, and I would add to the family. Now, establishing Zion, Joseph, the prophet, said the following: the building up of Zion is a cause that has interested the people of God in every age. It is a theme upon which prophets, priests, and kings have dwelt with peculiar delight. They have looked down forward with joyful anticipation of the day in which we live. The day, this was in Joseph's time, and it continues to the day we live. And fired with heavenly and joyful anticipations, they have sung and written and prophesied of this our day, but they died without sight. We are the favored people that God has made choice of to bring about that latter-day glory. So if I can say anything about the Lymans and the Partridges, it's the establishment of Zion. They were at ground zero in this dispensation to start the work. Now, in our now defunct high priest group, last year our goal was to, and our theme for the whole year was establishing Zion. And so one day, I live about an hour from the office, and I was commuting down in the office. People asked me how I could stand that, and I said, I don't really notice. I spend my first hour of the day in a devotional. And I said, if I'm in the car, I can't do anything, so I listen to general conference, I listen to the choir, I listen to the scriptures, and that's a whole hour of devotional. I said, if I were at home and tried to do that, after 5 minutes, I'd go, wonder what's in the refrigerator this morning. But being stuck in a car, and this being the theme, establishing Zion, I heard the choir sing, let Zion and her beauty rise. And it just moved me so emotionally, so spiritually. I went to the office and I looked it up, and lo and behold, it was Edward Partridge. I had no idea. I had never really focused on that before. But it was Edward Partridge. And so, you know the words, and I know the choir is going to sing it today, I hope, right? Let Zion her beauty rise. And as I reflected on this, it appeared, the first time it appeared was in Emma's first hymnal, 1835. Now, somewhere between 1831 and 1835, Edward pinned this. I heard yesterday somebody say 1831. I have never been able to find a source that said when he pinned this particular hymn. But if you read the words, and I'm not going to read all of it, you just are taken by the spirit of enthusiasm and joy that Edward Partridge felt about being able to participate in Zion and in the anticipation of the Savior returning to the earth and us being caught up to meet him. And in the last stanza, this is the last verse, is after the Savior will soon appear, the saints to save, his enemies subdue. So I think they were already in the throes of the Missouri persecutions when he wrote this. But then the last, and there's a lot of verses. In our hymnal, we only have 3 verses. There's 7 or 8 verses that he wrote. And you can Google and find them. They're pretty spectacular. I had no idea how this frontier, I know the Partridge family did get the formal education, but I have no idea where he got his poetic capabilities and his vision, except through the Spirit. That glorious rest will then commence, which prophets did foretell, when saints will reign with Christ on earth. Excuse me. And in his presence dwell 1,000 years of glorious day. Dear Lord, prepare my heart to stand with thee on Zion's mount and never more to part. Now, I'm going to end where I began. The legacy of the Lyman and Partridge family. And to me, it's the spiritual heritage. It's in the marrow of our bones. Our testimonies of the gospel have been come down through that generation. There's a lot of talk about ministering now in the church, and part of that ministering includes the ministering of angels. Edward Partridge was promised that he would have the ministering of angels in his particular stewardship. We are all promised that we will have the ministering angels, and we have our neighbors who minister to us, our fellow ward members who minister to us, but we have our ancestors who minister to us. And I'm hoping they're here, and I'm hoping they're looking with joy and gratitude that they have a posterity that is faithful. The reason you have reunions, the reason you have a society, it's not to learn sterile facts about history. That's not what it is. It's to honor them who sacrificed so much so that we could benefit from the gospel of Jesus Christ, and for us as their descendants to recommit ourselves to live our lives. Every time you go to the temple and you walk out of the endowment, you make sure that you understand that you're fulfilling part of the promises that they received when they did their endowment. Think about that for a while. As their faithful posterity, we are helping them enjoy the blessings and promises of the endowment. So, as we conclude, again, I just want to thank David and the organizers. It's fun to come and just start talking genealogy with people that you've never met before. Because after a minute, it's not that you're strangers, you are just cousins. And I'd love to be around my cousins. So thank you very much, and this has been a great event. Thank you.